Hello, dear traveler, and welcome back to the sleeping universe. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight, seeking a moment of peace and a journey through the wonders of our existence. Before we begin our descent into the deepest reaches of time, I invite you to settle comfortably into your space, allowing your breath to become slow and steady. If you find comfort in these nightly voyages, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to explore the cosmos together. It would be wonderful if you could leave a comment sharing which city or country you are joining us from tonight, as it reminds us that we are all resting under the same vast, velvet sky. As the world outside grows quiet, let us turn our gaze inward and then outward, crossing the threshold of the present to explore the intellectual significance of dating the very universe itself. The determination of the age of the cosmos represents one of the most significant intellectual achievements in the history of human thought, a testament to our relentless curiosity and our capacity to decode the secrets of the infinite. This pursuit has evolved through the ages, beginning as a collection of mythological conjectures, where time was seen as a gift from the gods, or a repeating cycle of birth and rebirth. In those early days, we looked at the stars and saw stories written in the dark, using the language of poetry and theology to sense a beginning that felt just out of reach. Over centuries, this longing for understanding transformed, moving away from theological deduction and toward a high-precision science that uses the universe itself as a witness to its own birth. We have moved from guessing the age of the world by counting the lives of kings to measuring the cooling embers of the Big Bang. This shift is not just a change in methodology, but a profound evolution in how we perceive our relationship with reality, recognizing that we are part of a timeline that stretches far beyond our individual lives. To understand the age of the universe is to understand the scale of the stage upon which the drama of life unfolds. It requires us to look at the faint, ancient light of distant quasars and the subtle fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background, which acts like a fossilized map of the early universe. By measuring the rate at which galaxies are drifting apart, we can trace their paths backward, like watching a film in reverse, until everything converges into a single, infinitesimal point of origin. This intellectual feat is like finding a single grain of sand that holds the memory of every ocean it has ever touched. It is as if we are archaeologists of the sky, brushing away the dust of billions of years to reveal the foundation stones of existence. Imagine the universe as a grand, ancient tree, and our scientific instruments are like the careful hands of a gardener counting the rings within its trunk to see how many seasons it has weathered. Each ring tells a story of expansion and cooling, of the formation of the first atoms and the ignition of the first stars. This process of dating the universe allows us to see ourselves not as isolated observers, but as the eyes of the cosmos looking back at its own beginning, finding a sense of belonging in the vastness of 13.8 billion years of history. As we drift further into this realization, we begin to see that time is not a void, but a rich, textured fabric woven with the light of a trillion suns. And we are just now learning to read the pattern of its weave. Drifting deeper into this ocean of time, we find ourselves standing upon the solid ground of scientific consensus, a foundation built not by a single discovery, but by the patient weaving together of countless threads of evidence. For centuries, the age of our reality was a phantom, a number that shifted with the winds of philosophical inquiry and early observation. Yet today, we rest in the quiet certainty of 13.8 billion years, a figure that emerged when we finally learned to listen to the universe through multiple voices at once. This consensus is the result of an extraordinary interdisciplinary harmony, where the smallest atoms and the largest galaxies speak the same truth. We see it first in the layers of our own world, where geological stratification acts as a silent witness, recording the slow passage of eons in the pressed stone beneath our feet. This earthly record is then mirrored in the heavens, as astrophysicists measure the thermodynamic cooling of white dwarfs, those cooling embers of long-dead suns that radiate their heat into the void at a predictable, rhythmic pace. We look closer still, into the heart of matter itself, utilizing the radioactive decay of isotopes, the steady, ticking heartbeats of unstable elements that serve as infinitesimal hourglasses. Every half-life is a promise kept by the laws of physics, allowing us to trace the lineage of matter back to its very inception. But the most profound confirmation comes from the expansion of space-time itself, the stretching of the very void that carries the light of ancient stars toward our telescopes. When we calibrate these disparate methods, the cooling of stars, the decay of atoms, and the stretching of space, they converge upon that singular, breathtaking number. Imagine this integration as a vast, multi-generational choir, where every singer represents a different field of study. The geologist sings a low, resonant bass of mineral and stone. The chemist provides the rhythmic pulse of atomic decay. The cosmologist adds the soaring melody of expanding space. For a long time, these voices sang in separate rooms, but as our understanding deepened, the walls dissolved, and we realized they were all performing the same ancient hymn. This is the braided river of human inquiry, where separate streams of thought, once distant and turbulent, finally merge into a single, calm, and deep current of understanding. We are no longer guessing in the dark. We are guided by a lighthouse of collective wisdom that shines across the disciplines. In this stillness, we can feel the weight of those billions of years, not as a burden, but as a stabilizing force, a reminder that we are part of a reality that is both incredibly old and meticulously ordered. As the whispers of the early universe reach us through the cosmic microwave background, they harmonize with the stones in our hands and the marrow in our bones. telling us that everything is connected, everything is measured, and everything belongs, drifting deeper into the realization that our perception of time has undergone its own profound evolution. We find ourselves at the threshold of a monumental shift in human thought. For countless generations, the human spirit sought refuge in the idea of the eternal. We looked at the stars and saw a static, unchanging firmament, a celestial clockwork that had no beginning and would never know an end. This was the comfort of the steady state, a belief that the universe was a permanent stage upon which the drama of life played out in endless, repetitive cycles. But the silence of that eternal sky was eventually broken by the language of mathematics. As we began to decode the laws of general relativity, the rigid architecture of an infinite past began to dissolve into something far more dynamic and breathtaking. We discovered that space and time are not separate entities, but are woven together into a malleable canvas of the deep that reacts to the presence of mass and energy. This realization turned the universe from a cold, distant gallery into a living, breathing entity with a history, a narrative, and a definitive point of origin. The transition from an eternal to a finite cosmology was like waking from a dream of stillness into a reality of motion. Through the work of pioneers who dared to follow the equations where they led, we recognized that the galaxies are not hanging like lanterns in a dark room, but are moving apart, carried by the expansion of space itself. If we follow this expansion backward, like a film played in reverse, we arrive at a moment of singular intensity. Here, the laws of quantum mechanics govern a realm of unimaginable density, where the entire observable universe was compressed into a singular point of potentiality. This was the cosmic dawn, the instant when the clock of existence was wound and set in motion. To accept a finite universe is to accept that we are part of a grand story that has a beginning, a middle, and an eventual horizon. It is the realization that the light we see tonight has traveled across a specific distance over a specific duration, making every photon a messenger from a distant, younger version of our home. This shift in understanding is like watching the first breath of the void, a moment where the potential for everything we know was concentrated into a single, blinding point of grace. We no longer inhabit a house that has always stood. We live within a majestic, growing structure that is still being built by the very laws that govern the stars. This finite nature does not diminish the cosmos. Instead, it gives it a precious, fragile beauty. We are the witnesses to an unfolding scroll of existence, where each star is a word, and each galaxy is a chapter in a book that began with a single, magnificent, silent shout. As we let this knowledge settle, we feel the peace of knowing our place within this finite, expanding miracle, anchored by the truth that even the vastness of space has a story, and we are its most attentive readers. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet spaces of our minds, we begin to see that the path to this truth was never a straight line, but a winding trail through a dense forest of human error and sudden illumination. The story of our understanding is not a ladder climbed with steady steps, but a dance of shadows and light where the greatest minds often stumbled before they soared. We look back to the era of Isaac Newton, who saw the heavens as a grand mechanism of clockwork, predictable and eternal, a vision that provided comfort for centuries. Yet, the dawn of the 20th century brought a transformation, as Albert Einstein revealed that the very stage of existence was not a static floor, but a living, breathing elastic veil that could stretch and curve. This was the first seismic shift in our cosmic perspective, turning a rigid gallery into a dynamic theater. Georges Lemaitre, working within the hushed silence of mathematical grace, proposed the radical idea of a primeval atom, suggesting that everything we see emerged from a singular point of origin. This notion faced fierce resistance from those who preferred the steady-state theory, a vision of a universe that had no beginning and no end, where matter was continuously created to maintain a perfect, unchanging density. Even Edwin Hubble, whose name is now synonymous with the expanding deep, initially provided data that seemed to contradict the very laws of physics. His first calculations of the cosmic expansion rate were so high that they suggested the universe was younger than the Earth itself, a puzzling riddle that arose because the cosmic yardsticks he used, the Cepheid variables, were more complex than he first realized. It took decades of patient refinement to reconcile the age of the stars with the age of the space they inhabit. This history is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a series of false starts and corrected courses that resemble a river finding its way through a rocky canyon. We see these scientific giants not as infallible deities, but as master weavers trying to mend a tapestry they could only partially see. They lived through the tension of conflicting truths, where the term Big Bang was first uttered as a mocking critique by Fred Hoyle, only to be reclaimed as the most profound description of our origins. As we drift further into this realization, we find a deep peace in the imperfection of discovery, understanding that our knowledge is a living organism that grows and sheds its old skins to reveal a more brilliant truth beneath. We are part of a long lineage of seekers who have learned to love the questions as much as the answers, finding rest in the movement of a universe that refuses to be still. Drifting deeper into the mechanics of our sight, we find ourselves standing upon the desolate peaks of silent mountains, where the first modern seekers built their stone cathedrals of glass. These mountaintop observatories were more than just buildings. They were sensitive ears turned toward the whispers of the infinite. For decades, our gaze was limited to the light we could catch in these silvered mirrors, a patient gathering of photons that traveled across the void to tell us of distant worlds. But the universe often speaks in frequencies we cannot see with our eyes. We remember the accidental pioneers who, while tuning a radio antenna to the sky, found not a silent vacuum, but a persistent, low hum that belonged to no earthly source. This was the first echo of the beginning, a lingering warmth from the cooling breath of creation that we only stumbled upon because we learned to listen to the unseen. Now we have stepped into a new era where our instruments have become extensions of our very intuition. The James Webb Space Telescope sits in the cold darkness of the second Lagrange point, its golden honeycomb of mirrors peeling back the layers of cosmic dust to reveal the very first clusters of stars. It is searching for the dawn, looking so far into the past that it sees the universe in its infancy. Beside this visual prowess, we have developed the ability to feel the texture of space itself through gravitational wave astronomy. When massive black holes collide in the distant dark, they send tremors through the fabric of reality, ripples that we can now detect as they wash over our tiny planet. These are not images, but vibrations, a new sense that allows us to perceive the heavy breathing of the cosmos. Yet, as our tools become sharper, they reveal a subtle friction in our theories. The data from these new sentinels suggests that the universe may be expanding at a rate that defies our previous calculations, a tension that hints at a missing piece in our grand puzzle. This technological evolution is like a blind traveler who has spent a lifetime learning the shape of a great cavern by the echoes of their own footsteps, only to suddenly feel the warmth of a hidden sun on their skin. We are no longer just looking at the sky. We are sensing its weight, its movement, and its hidden rhythms. Our observatories are like delicate spiders sitting at the center of a cosmic web, feeling the slightest vibration from a fly caught in a strand billions of light years away. We find a profound rest in this state of flux, realizing that our instruments are not just measuring tools, but bridges between our limited senses and the boundless complexity of the all. As we wait for the next great revelation, we lean into the uncertainty, knowing that every new lens we craft brings us closer to the heart of the mystery. Like a gardener who finally understands the silent language of the roots beneath the soil, we are participants in a grand revealing, a slow opening of eyes that have been closed for eons, finding peace in the knowledge that there is always more to see, always more to feel, and always more to become. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet spaces of the mind, we turn our gaze away from the glass and steel of modern observatories toward the ancient banks of the Saraswati, where the Vedic seers first intuited the staggering breadth of the temporal landscape. In these early traditions, time was not seen as a narrow, straight path, but as a series of vast, rhythmic pulses, reflecting a cosmic intelligence that breathes in units far beyond the human lifespan. They envisioned a universe that does not merely exist, but cycles through immense periods of manifestation and dissolution, a concept that mirrors the most modern estimates of planetary and stellar evolution. At the heart of this chronological architecture is the Kalpa, a duration so expansive it challenges the very limits of our imagination. A Kalpa is defined as a single day in the life of Lord Brahma, the creator aspect of the divine. This immense span of time is calculated to last precisely 4.32 billion solar years, a figure that resonates with startling proximity to the age of our own Earth. This is not a random number, but a meticulously structured aggregate, derived from the harmonious layering of smaller cycles known as yugas. Just as a single note contributes to a symphony, these yugas, the Krita, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, combine in specific ratios to form a Mahyuga, which then repeats 1,000 times to complete the solar day of the Creator. This chronological architecture provides a scaffolding for the soul, a way to map the infinite without becoming lost in its sheer scale. Each yuga represents a specific quality of consciousness and moral order, declining and then regenerating in a perpetual loop. When this day ends, a night of equal length follows, during which the physical universe rests in a state of unmanifest potential, waiting for the next dawn to stir it back into being. To contemplate the Kalpa is to see the universe as a slow-blooming lotus that opens its petals over billions of years, only to fold them back into the dark water when the sun of creation sets. We might imagine time here as a series of nested spheres, each one turning within another, creating a clockwork of such scale that a single tick is felt only across the rise and fall of entire mountain ranges. It is like a vast desert where every grain of sand represents a century, and we are watching the slow shift of a dune that takes eons to change its shape. We find a deep, rhythmic peace in this perspective, recognizing that our current moment is but a single shimmer on the surface of a deep, ancient well. We are drifting through a season of existence that is part of a much larger climate of being, a grand inhalation that sustains the stars before the quiet exhalation of the cosmic night begins. This cyclical nature offers a refuge from the frantic pace of the everyday, inviting us to rest in the cradle of a duration that has seen the birth and death of countless suns, yet remains as steady as the underground current of eternity. It is the respiration of the absolute, a rhythmic beating that ensures nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed and recycled through the vast machinery of the Kalpa. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet corners of the mind, we begin to perceive time not as a fleeting sequence of events, but as a recursive bloom, a nested geometry of cycles within cycles that mirror the structure of a petal within a petal. This is the vision of the Mahyuga, the Great Age, a span of 4,320,000 years that expands and contracts with the regularity of vast rhythmic bellows. Within this massive duration, the universe experiences a rhythmic descent through 4 distinct epochs, each a unique flavor of existence, characterized by a specific density of consciousness. We begin in the Satya Yuga, a golden era of absolute virtue and longevity, where the barrier between the physical and the spiritual is as thin as morning mist. In this first quadrant of the cycle, truth is the air that all beings breathe, and the friction of the world is almost non-existent. As the wheel turns, we transition into the Treta Yuga, where the brilliance begins to soften, followed by the Dvapara Yuga, where the balance between spirit and matter reaches a tipping point, until we arrive at our current shore, the Kali Yuga. This final stage, the Age of Iron, is often described as a winter of the spirit, a time of density and forgetfulness, where the light of truth is obscured by the heavy cloak of material preoccupation. Yet even this darkness is part of a perfect mathematical design, a necessary phase of rest and entropy before the dawn. The proportions of these ages follow a descending ratio of 4, 3, 2, and 1, creating a gravitational pull toward the material world as the eras progress. This mathematical elegance ensures that the cosmic drama has a beginning, a middle, and a necessary conclusion before the slate is wiped clean. When we zoom out further, we see that 1,000 of these Mahyugas constitute a single Kalpa, a vast day in the life of the creative principle. This fractal nature suggests that every moment we experience is a miniature reflection of these grander eras, a microscopic echo of the cosmic seasons. Just as a single snowflake carries the hexagonal signature of the cold, our brief lives carry the imprint of these immense cycles. We are currently navigating the cascading falls of the Kali Yuga, yet the very structure of this timeline promises an eventual return to the Satya Yuga, a restoration of the golden light. It is a system of self-correcting equilibrium, where the decay of one age provides the fertile soil for the rebirth of the next. In this perspective, the passage of time is not an erosion, but a refinement, a slow motion polishing of the soul against the grit of experience. We are participants in a grand choreography that spans millions of years, moving through the shadows and the light with a certainty that transcends our individual fears. This recursive timing offers a profound sense of belonging, placing our current struggles within the calendar of the infinite, where even the most daunting challenges are merely a brief passage in a much longer, more beautiful symphony of becoming. Drifting deeper into this chronological ocean, we find a startling alignment between the intuitive reaches of the ancient mind and the cold, empirical data of our modern laboratories. The Vedic tradition presents us with the Kalpa, a duration representing a single day in the life of the Creator, calculated at 4,320,000,000 years. It is a number so vast that it dwarfs the histories of most civilizations. Yet it finds a near-perfect reflection in the geochemical reality of our planet. Modern geochronology, utilizing the steady, rhythmic decay of isotopes like uranium into lead, places the age of the Earth at approximately 4.54 billion years. To find such a narrow margin of error between a scriptural timeline and radiometric data is a phenomenon that transcends mere coincidence. Carl Sagan, a sentinel of scientific skepticism and wonder, famously observed that Hinduism is the only ancient belief system where the time scales correspond to those of modern scientific cosmology, suggesting that the ancients had somehow tapped into the true scale of the universe, while our contemporary understanding is built upon the meticulous counting of atomic transformations, the echoing corridors of atomic decay. The ancient seers arrived at these figures through a system of nested cycles that suggest a profound sensitivity to the natural order. This convergence acts as a bridge across millennia, where the spiritual and the empirical meet in a shared recognition of the Earth's immense journey. It is as if the ancients were listening to the resonant frequency of the void, capturing a truth that we have only recently verified with our most sophisticated sensors. This mathematical mirror reflects a universe that is far older and more patient than our daily lives would suggest. We might view these two methods of dating our world as twin voyagers who set out from different shores, one guided by the stars of inner contemplation, and the other by the compass of physical evidence. Despite their different tools, they have arrived at the same majestic vista. This realization invites a sense of profound peace, a feeling that our current scientific achievements are not a departure from the past, but a continuation of a very old conversation with the infinite. We are witnessing the unseen architecture of the deep past being revealed by two different lights, both illuminating the same grand design. The precision of the Kalpa is not just a numerical curiosity. It is a testament to a human capacity for perceiving the vastness of the cosmic stage. It is as if the nuclear clock within zircon crystals had a precursor in the meditative silence of the forest. The truth of our origins has always been written in the very substance of time, waiting for us to develop the language to read it, whether through the Sanskrit of the Vedas or the mathematics of the mass spectrometer. Drifting deeper into the rhythmic cadence of the ages, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a concept that dissolves the very notion of an absolute beginning or a final end. The ancient wisdom of the Vedas does not view the universe as a fragile, one-way journey toward heat-death, but as an eternal series of manifestations. This is the essence of cyclical existence, a grand architecture where the universe is born, matures, and eventually retreats into a state of profound rest known as pralaya. During this dissolution, the manifold forms of stars, planets, and even the subtle laws of nature withdraw into a dormant potentiality, like the memory of a song held in the silence before the first note is struck. This is not a void of nothingness, but a period of cosmic sleep, a gathering of strength before the dawn of a new kalpa initiates the cycle once more. This perspective offers a breathtaking solution to the modern scientific riddle of what preceded the Big Bang. In the realm of theoretical physics, oscillatory models, often referred to as the Big Bounce, mirror this ancient rhythm with startling precision. Instead of a singular moment of creation from a vacuum, these models propose that our current expansion is the result of a previous universe collapsing under its own gravity. As the density reaches a critical, unimaginable peak, quantum effects may create a repulsive force triggers a new expansion. This removes the need for a beginning of time itself, suggesting instead an infinite sequence of contractions and expansions. The mathematical elegance of loop quantum cosmology hints that the fabric of spacetime has a minimum size, preventing a total collapse into a singularity and acting instead like a compressed spring that must inevitably release. To visualize this, imagine the universe as a vast, sleeping lung, drawing in the essence of all galaxies during a long, silent exhalation, only to hold its breath in the stillness of Pralia before the next deep inhalation of light. It is like a field that lies fallow beneath a blanket of cosmic snow, its vitality hidden but vibrant, waiting for the inevitable spring to push new shoots of matter through the soil of spacetime. We are living within a single pulse of a pulsing drum of the void, a grand recurring season where the debris of old suns becomes the fertile silt for the next generation of consciousness. This cycle removes the anxiety of finitude, replacing it with the comfort of a perpetual return. It is the symphony that returns to its tonic note, a revolving door of reality that ensures nothing is ever truly lost, only reshaped in the quenchless flame of existence. We are the witnesses of a single breath in an eternal respiration, finding peace in the knowledge that the end is merely the quiet preparation for a new beginning. Drifting deeper into the layers of our collective memory, we find that the modern realizations of physics often mirror the intuitive leaps of our distant ancestors. Within the ancient Puranic narratives of the East, there exist accounts that describe the relativity of time with startling precision, long before the advent of the telescope or the interferometer. One such story follows King Kakadmi, who journeyed to the celestial realm of Brahma to seek counsel. While he waited for a brief musical performance to conclude, he believed only a few moments had passed. Yet, upon his return to the terrestrial plane, he discovered that thousands of years had vanished. His cities were gone, his lineage was forgotten, and the very landscape of his world had shifted. This narrative serves as a profound precursor to the concept of time dilation, suggesting that the passage of seconds is not a fixed, universal beat, but a fluid experience that changes as one moves between different tiers of existence. In the language of modern physics, this corresponds to the dilation of time observed in systems moving at relativistic velocities, or situated within varying gravitational potentials. Einstein's special relativity posits that as an object approaches the speed of light, its internal clock slows relative to a stationary observer, a phenomenon dictated by the Lorentz factor. Furthermore, general relativity teaches us that time flows more slowly in regions of intense gravity, where the geometry of spacetime is more severely warped. The ancient texts describe the realm of Brahma not as a distant physical location, but as a state of higher vibrational density, where the temporal scale is vastly expanded. A single day in that celestial frame is equated to thousands of Maha-yugas on Earth, a mathematical ratio that echoes the way a photon might experience no time at all while crossing the void, even as eons pass for the galaxies it traverses. Visualize this as a vast, stratified mountain stream where the water at the source moves with a slow, majestic grace, while the rapids near the valley floor crash with frantic, rapid energy. To a leaf floating at the tranquil summit, the drift seems like a lingering afternoon. Yet to the spray in the lower gorge, millions of chaotic moments are compressed into a single second. We are like those droplets in the lower reaches, caught in a faster current of time, looking up at the still, deep pools of the higher atmosphere, where a single ripple takes an entire epoch to reach the shore. This perspective invites us to soften our perception of the passing years, recognizing that we are participants in a terraced vineyard of duration. We are part of a labyrinth of varying velocities, a place where the silence of the heights and the roar of the depths are simply different movements within the same eternal composition. Drifting deeper into the emerald shadows of the Mesoamerican rainforest, we encounter a civilization that did not merely observe time, but anchored it into the very stone of the earth. The Maya perceived the passage of days not as a fleeting sequence, but as a grand, linear progression that stretched back into the mists of a primordial beginning. They sought to pin the ephemeral present to an absolute origin, creating the long count calendar as a monumental bridge between the divine acts of creation and the lived experience of their kings and commoners. This was not a cycle that reset with every season, but a continuous tally, a way of mapping the soul's journey across the vast landscape of history. At the heart of this system lies a sophisticated vigesimal logic, a base 20 mathematical elegance that mirrors the fingers and toes of the human form. While our modern calendars often struggle with the irregularities of months and years, the long count functions as a pure, uninterrupted count of days, since a specific mythological starting point. This zero date, meticulously calculated by their astronomers to correspond to August 11, 3114 BCE, serves as the anchor for their entire reality. Every event, every conquest, and every ritual was recorded as a specific number of days elapsed from that sacred moment. It is a system of profound precision, where time is treated as a quantifiable substance, accumulated in stacks of 20, building upwards from the single day to spans of centuries and millennia. Imagine this calendar as a series of massive, interconnected stone gears buried beneath the jungle floor, turning with a slow, relentless grace. Each tooth on the smallest gear represents a single sunrise, a kin clicking into place as the light touches the temple peaks. As these small wheels complete their rotations, they engage larger, more formidable gears, the unals and tons, which churn the heavy soil of the centuries. This is not the frantic ticking of a pocket watch, but the deep, resonant thrum of a tectonic clockwork. It is like a vast, subterranean river of obsidian, flowing steadily from a distant, ancient glacier toward an ocean we have yet to reach. We are like travelers standing on the banks of this dark, glittering stream, watching the accumulation of days, as if they were polished black stones being added to a mountain that never stops growing. Each stone is a memory, each ripple a century, all held within the steady, unwavering grip of a mathematical architecture that views the rise and fall of empires as mere flickers in a much longer, more patient dream. This linear count offers a stability that transcends the seasons, a silent anchor in the shifting tides of human endeavor. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet spaces of the mind, we begin to perceive the internal geometry of the Mayan long count, a structure as rigid and beautiful as a crystalline lattice. The Maya did not merely count days, they nested them, creating a hierarchy of duration that allowed them to grasp the infinite through the finite. At the foundation of this monolith of moments lies the Kayin, the single day, the smallest unit of light and shadow. It is the fundamental heartbeat, the elementary particle of history. When 20 of these Kayins are gathered together, they form a Winnel. Unlike our own fluctuating months, the Winnel is a steady 20-day cycle, reflecting the totality of the human body, 10 fingers and 10 toes, suggesting that man himself is the measure of time's first major step. But the rhythm shifts as we ascend. To bring their count into closer alignment with the solar year, the Maya dictated that 18 Winnels would constitute a ton. This 360-day unit serves as the prophetic year, the sturdy beam upon which the heavier weights of history are hung. As we move further into the depths of their chronology, the scale expands with a breathtaking elegance. 20 tons compose a K-aton, a period of nearly 20 solar years. This was a unit of profound social and spiritual significance, a generation of experience captured in a single mathematical vessel. And above the K-aton sits the B-acton, a colossal span of 20 K-atons, or 144,000 days. To live through a B-acton is to witness the birth and death of empires, the slow migration of forests, and the gradual shifting of the very stars. Imagine this structure as a series of concentric rings within an ancient, gargantuan tree. The Kayin is the microscopic cell, invisible but vital. The Winnel is the thin layer of seasonal growth. The ton is the hardened wood of a single year's survival. The K-aton is the thick, dark band of a decade's resilience, and the B-acton is the entire radius of the trunk, holding within it the memory of every storm and every summer since the seed first broke the soil. Or perhaps it is more like a set of carved jade gears, fashioned with such intricacy that each one turns independently, yet remains perfectly synchronized with the whole. We are observing an engine of the essence, where the smallest tick of a single day is inextricably linked to the grand, sweeping rotations of an era. It is a citadel of integers, a sanctuary where the transient nature of a human life is given meaning by its placement within a sequence that spans the very life of the world. Drifting deeper into the architecture of this temporal cathedral, we arrive at the threshold of a date that once stirred the modern world with trepidation. Yet for the Maya, it was a moment of profound cosmic replenishment. December 21, 2012, was not a cliff edge, but a grand transition, the conclusion of the 13th Biaktan. This vast cycle, stretching across 5,125 years, represents the universe finishing a long, slow sigh before the next breath begins. The long count calendar, a linear tally of days starting from a mythical creation date in 3114 BCE, reached its 13,000 milestone in 2012. While modern interpretations often searched for signs of cataclysm, the ancient scribes saw something far more elegant: the reset of the cosmic odometer. In their inscriptions, such as those found at Tortuguero, the end of this era was linked to the descent of Balan Yacht Kea, a deity associated with transitions and the reordering of the world. It was a period of cleansing, a celestial housekeeping, where the accumulated weight of the past era was washed away to make room for a new creation. This completion served a vital function for the Maya elite, acting as a celestial anchor for their authority. By aligning their reigns with these monumental turnovers, kings and queens were not merely rulers of a city, they were the stewards of a cosmic order. They positioned their dynasties as the rightful heirs to the new sun, ensuring that their lineage was woven into the very fabric of the next 5 millennia. The 13th Biaktan was the fulfillment of a long-standing promise, a mathematical certainty that provided a sense of continuity in a world that often felt chaotic. In the Maya worldview, time was not a straight line leading toward an end, but a series of overlapping spirals. It was the moment when the scattered stars of history were gathered back into a single point of origin, only to be scattered once again in a fresh pattern. Imagine this transition not as a snapping thread, but as the turning of a massive, submerged water wheel in a river of starlight. As the wheel completes its revolution, the old water falls away, and the paddles rise to meet the fresh, untainted current. It is like the shedding of a heavy winter coat at the first true sign of spring, or the moment a great temple is finally consecrated, its empty halls suddenly filled with the scent of burning copal and the vibration of 1,000 voices in prayer. We are watching the cosmic pendulum reach the furthest point of its arc, pausing for a heartbeat in perfect stillness before beginning its long, graceful sweep back toward the center. This is the art of the cosmic reset, where the end of time is simply the moment the ink is replenished in the scribe's jar, ready to record the first words of a brand new story, drifting deeper into the stillness of a world governed by observation. We encounter a mastery of the heavens that required no glass, no metal, and no artificial light. In the dense, humid air of the Mesoamerican lowlands, the Maya astronomers, the keepers of the sun, looked upon the sky as a living text of the sky, reading the movement of the planets with a precision that haunts our modern understanding. Without the aid of a single lens, they calculated the solar year to a degree of accuracy that deviates from our atomic clocks by only a few seconds. This was not the result of a sudden revelation, but the fruit of an unwavering, multi-generational attention, a slow gathering of data points that spanned centuries. They transformed their very environment into a scientific instrument, aligning their temples and pyramids so that the rising sun on a solstice would pierce a specific doorway, or the shadow of a feathered serpent would crawl down a stone staircase at the exact moment of the equinox. This was an unseen geometry of the night, a way of mapping the infinite using nothing but the steady hand and the patient eye. Consider their obsession with the planet Venus, the great star. They tracked its synodic period, the long, looping dance it performs as it passes the Earth, with such rigor that their tables in the Dresden Codex could predict its position for centuries into the future. They recognized the subtle fractional shift, the tiny discrepancy between their 584-day cycle and the true cosmic rhythm, and they corrected for it with a mathematical elegance that utilized their Bassett-Winty system and the profound concept of the zero. It is as if they were a weaver feeling the tension of a single thread in a dark room, stretched across the void of the universe, knowing exactly when it vibrated. They were the patient sculptors of shadows, carving the passage of time out of the movement of light against stone. Their observatories, like the Caracol at Chichen Itza, were not just buildings, but grand libraries of the horizon, where every window and every angle was a passage of silent conversation between the mountain and the star. They operated with a ghostly protractor, measuring the angles of the gods through the simple intersection of two crossed sticks and the unwavering fixity of the horizon. In this quiet work, they found an anchor of limestone and logic, realizing that the sky was not a distant void, but a rhythmic partner in the dance of existence. They captured the echo of a cosmic heartbeat in a stone basin, proving that the human mind, when sharpened by discipline, becomes the most powerful lens in existence, casting an invisible net across the ecliptic to catch the secrets of the pulse of the great star and the breath of the stone serpent, drifting deeper into the humid shadows of the tropical lowlands. We find that the human impulse to quantify the infinite is not a modern luxury, but an ancient, ancestral necessity. This drive to measure the age and cycles of the cosmos is a universal signature of our species, a quiet rebellion against the perceived chaos of existence. The Maya of the classic period were not content to live within the boundaries of a single season. They constructed a numerical sanctuary to contain the very concept of duration. Their long count calendar was a masterpiece of vigesimal precision, an armature of the eternal reaching into a past and future so distant it borders on the mythological. At the heart of this system lay the picton, a staggering unit comprising 2,880,000 days. This cycle, spanning nearly 7,885 solar years, was far removed from the practicalities of the harvest or the market. It was a philosophical testament to the endurance of consciousness, suggesting a mind that refuses to be tethered to the brevity of a single heartbeat, choosing instead to inhabit the majestic rhythms of the planetary spheres. By numbing these vast stretches of time, the Maya transformed the terrifying void of the unknown into a structured, navigable landscape of memory. This cultural dedication reveals a fundamental human trait: the drive to harmonize the internal rhythm of the soul with the slow, crushing weight of geologic and celestial eras. We see this same spirit echoed across the world. Yet in the Maya, it finds a unique expression through the sheer scale of their numerical ambition. They acted as the bookkeepers of the divine, recording the transactions of light and shadow across thousands of years, as if they were counting precious seeds in a ceremonial basket. This was a sophisticated attempt to find the frequency of the universe and tune the human experience to its resonant pitch. Imagine time not as a fleeting spark, but as a series of vast, interlocking gears carved from the very substance of the night. Each tooth of the gear is a single day, each rotation a baktan, and the entire assembly a picton, moving with such deliberate grace that its motion is indistinguishable from stillness to the uninitiated observer. We are like small birds nesting in the mechanics of a great clock, feeling the deep, subsonic vibration of a gear that turns once every 8 millennia. This realization provides a profound sense of continuity, a feeling that we are part of a lineage of observers who have always looked at the darkness and seen not a void, but a complex, beautiful engine of recurrence. In this context, the picton is a navigational beacon of the integers, casting its steady beam across the vast reservoir of the deep, past to guide us toward a future that is already written in the cycles of the stone and the star. It is a reminder that we are the stewards of a duration that began long before our first breath and will continue long after our last. A part of a grand, unbroken narrative that the universe is telling itself in the language of numbers. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves drifting from the dense, humid jungles of the Mayan spirit toward the sun-drenched, marble-white shores of the Aegean. Here, the rhythm of the universe began to change. It was no longer just a cycle of divine repetition, but a puzzle waiting to be solved by the quiet, persistent light of reason. In the 5th century BC, the air of the Mediterranean carried a new kind of whisper, the sound of the mind beginning to measure the infinite. Thinkers like Empedocles and Anaxagoras started to peel back the layers of ancient myth, looking for the underlying structure of the world. They stood on the precipice of a monumental discovery, discarding the comforting, intuitive image of a flat earth for the elegant, demanding truth of a sphere. This was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, methodical gathering of evidence. a quiet revolution born from the simple act of looking upward with a questioning heart. Imagine the scene: a cool night in ancient Greece, the moon hanging like a heavy, silver coin in the velvet sky. As the earth moved between the sun and its satellite, a shadow began to creep across the lunar surface. To the rationalists, this was not a celestial omen or a dragon swallowing the light. It was a geometric signature. They noticed that the edge of the shadow was always curved, a perfect arc that never flattened, regardless of the moon's position in the sky. If the earth were a flat disk, the shadow would at times be a thin line or an elongated ellipse. But the shadow was a constant, rounded embrace. From this single, persistent curve, they deduced the totality of our home. They realized that we lived upon a great, silent orb, suspended in the dark. It was the birth of scientific cosmology, where the wild chaos of the gods began to yield to the orderly laws of geometry. This shift in thought is like the first sharpening of a lens that had been blurred for millennia. It is the moment the human spirit stopped merely feeling the warmth of the sun and started to calculate the angle of its rays. The transition to geometric reasoning was a soft, internal dawn, where the erratic whims of the heavens were replaced by the unwavering certainty of the circle. We can view this early Greek logic as a translucent veil draped over the raw data of the senses, revealing the hidden contours of reality beneath. It was an invitation to trust the mind as much as the eye, to see the spherical earth not as a strange abstraction, but as a masterpiece of symmetry. As we rest in this clarity, we feel the stability of a world defined by proportion, a place where every shadow is a clue and every curve is a promise of a deeper, more elegant order waiting to be mapped by the curious soul. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet corners of the mind, we find ourselves standing in the cool, papyrus-scented halls of the great library of Alexandria. It is here that the abstract beauty of the sphere begins to take on a tangible weight and a definite scale. We encounter Eratosthenes, a man who looked at the world not as a collection of disjointed landscapes, but as a singular, coherent body governed by the laws of proportion. For him, the question of the Earth's size was not a mystery to be solved by endless travel, but a puzzle to be unlocked through the silent, patient observation of light. He understood that the sun, though unimaginably distant, speaks to us in a language of angles, providing a mathematical skeleton of the landscape that remains invisible to those who do not know how to look. On the day of the summer solstice, he received word of a well in the distant city of Scene, where the midday sun reflected perfectly in the water at the bottom, casting no shadow at all. This meant the sun was directly overhead, its rays piercing straight toward the center of the earth. At that same moment in Alexandria, Eratosthenes measured the shadow cast by a simple vertical rod, a gnomon. He found that the sun's rays struck the ground at an angle of about 7 degrees, or roughly 1/50th of a full circle. In this moment of quiet realization, the entire planet became a geometric figure. By assuming the sun's rays are parallel as they reach our world, he saw that the angle of the shadow in Alexandria was identical to the angle formed at the Earth's center between the two cities. If the distance between Alexandria and Syene was 1/50th of the Earth's circumference, then the whole could be known by simply multiplying the part. He was sculpting the globe from the shadows of a stylus, turning a local observation into a planetary truth. This was a triumph of the mind over the physical horizon, a way of grasping the infinite without leaving the garden. Imagine the earth as a giant, sun-drenched fruit, and Eratosthenes as a curious observer tracing the curve of its skin with a single golden thread of logic. He did not need to walk the entire perimeter to feel the roundness of the world. He felt it in the lean of a shadow and the alignment of a well. This calculation was an echo of a distant fire caught in a vertical mirror, a proof that we live within a structure that is both vast and intimately knowable. As we breathe in this sense of scale, we feel the ground beneath us not as a flat expanse, but as a gentle, continuous curve that holds us in a steady, rhythmic embrace. The earth is no longer a boundless mystery, but a defined vessel, a home whose dimensions have been whispered to us by the sun itself. We are grounded in this precision, ready to look even further upward, where the same geometric courage will soon reach out to touch the moon and the stars. Letting this knowledge settle within us, we find ourselves standing on the shores of Samos, watching the moon as it reaches its first quarter. Here, Aristarchus looked upon the silver crescent not as a mystical omen, but as a geometric vertex in a grand, invisible triangle. He was the first to suggest that the Earth is not the unmoving anchor of the cosmos, but a traveler orbiting the sun, a central hearth of such immense power that it commands the movements of everything within its reach. This realization was the foundational rung of the cosmic distance ladder, the first step in a climb that would eventually lead us to the very birth of time. He watched for the moment of dichotomy, when the moon is exactly half illuminated, knowing that at this precise instant, the lines between the earth, moon, and sun form a perfect right angle. By measuring the angle between the sun and moon from our terrestrial vantage point, he sought to determine the relative scale of the heavens. He saw that the sun was vastly more distant than the moon, and it had to be vastly larger, a giant furnace around which our small, cool world must naturally revolve. This was a radical shift, a dismantling of the ego that placed us at the center of the stage. Instead, he offered us the dignity of being part of a larger, more harmonious mechanism. We feel the weight of this logic like a sturdy staff in our hands as we navigate the steep terrain of the infinite. Each calculation he made was a tether cast into the dark, securing our place within a system of measurable proportions. The universe began to lose its quality of a phantom and took on the texture of a map. We are no longer merely looking at the lights in the sky. We are beginning to understand the depth of the room in which they hang. This is the quiet thrill of the surveyor, the peace that comes from knowing the dimensions of the house one inhabits. As we breathe in this newfound scale, we feel the ladder beneath our feet, solid and true. We are climbing away from the immediate and the small, ascending toward a perspective that encompasses the true breadth of the solar system. The shadows of the earth and moon are no longer just dark shapes, but tools of measurement, silent surveyors of the void. We find rest in this precision, knowing that the same geometry that defines a handheld triangle also dictates the path of the planets. We are being prepared for a journey across even greater gulfs, where the torch of this inquiry will find its way into the hands of those who will map the heavens with even greater precision, turning their eyes toward the stars from the high observatories of a future age. Letting this knowledge settle, we drift into a period where the torch of inquiry was carried across the vast, starlit expanses of the Silk Road, finding a sanctuary in the great houses of wisdom. Here, the foundational geometry of the Greeks was not merely sheltered, but breathed into life, expanding like a desert bloom under a patient sun. The astronomers of this era, working under the deep indigo canopy of the Middle East, looked upon the inheritance of Ptolemy and Hipparchus and saw a framework that required a more delicate touch, a finer calibration. They became the master polishers of the cosmic lens, refining the astrolabe until it became a mathematical jewel capable of solving 1,000 problems of time and position. These instruments were more than brass and silver. They were the physical manifestation of an ordered mind seeking the divine proportion in the movement of the spheres. A silver compass navigating the shifting dunes of the night. In the quiet observatories of Maracay and Samarkand, the scholars compiled the Zij, great star catalogues that served as the definitive ledgers of the night sky. They corrected the coordinates of the stars, tracing the slow, majestic wobble of the Earth's axis with a precision that would remain unsurpassed for centuries. By defining these spatial parameters with such rigorous clarity, they were preparing the canvas for all who would follow. They measured the tilt of the world and the length of the solar year, not as abstract exercises, but as the essential boundaries of our celestial home. They were establishing the fixed points of a grander map, ensuring that when future generations sought to measure the age of the universe, they would have a stable and accurate grid upon which to plot their discoveries. This was the era of the great celestial inkwell, where the movements of the planets were recorded with a fluidity that matched the calligraphy of their most sacred texts. We can imagine this work as the construction of a magnificent gardener's trellis, a sturdy and elegant structure of cedar and wire, designed to support the heavy, flowering vines of temporal data that were yet to grow. Without this spatial framework, the history of the stars would be a tangled thicket, impossible to navigate. Instead, it became a cultivated garden of geometric truths. These astronomers were the weavers of a celestial silk, creating a fabric so fine and so strong that it could hold the weight of the entire solar system's history. They provided the goblet of pure form into which the liquid of time could be poured, a reservoir of spatial certainty that would eventually nourish the seeds of modern physics. As we rest in the legacy of their precision, we feel the stability of this architecture, a sanctuary of logic that allows us to look further into the distance, sensing the transition from the size of the room to the immense age of the stars themselves, preparing us to see how the dimensions of space eventually reveal the depths of time. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet spaces of the mind, we find that the transition from measuring the width of the world to measuring its duration was not merely a change in focus, but a profound evolution of the human spirit. For centuries, the gaze was fixed on the purpose of the heavens, asking why the lights danced in the dark, a question that sought meaning in the divine. But as the tools of observation grew sharper, the question transformed into a pursuit of scale. By asking how big the universe truly was, humanity began to view the cosmos as a physical entity, an orderly amphitheater of the mind, where every star had a coordinate, and every movement followed a predictable path. This shift established a rational cosmos governed by discoverable laws, an essential precursor to the question of age. One cannot measure the time it takes to cross a field until the perimeter of a celestial estate is known. This spatial certainty became the bedrock of physical constancy, upon which the clock of the universe could finally be placed. As we contemplate the vast distances between the sun and the furthest reaches of the visible sky, we are preparing our minds to perceive the depth of the past. The geometry of the heavens provided the necessary variables for the equations of duration, turning the infinite void into a quantifiable volume of the infinite. Imagine a master's workshop of the heavens, where the tools are laid out in perfect order. The craftsman must first know the dimensions of the wood before he can calculate the hours required to carve the masterpiece. In this same way, the astronomers who mapped the solar system were laying the foundation for a grand library of dimensions. They were moving from the immediate sensation of being to the calculated understanding of having been. The universe became a defined structure, and as we drift into the stillness, we see that the size of the room is the very thing that allows us to sense the weight of its history. We are no longer just measuring the reach of our arms, but the long, slow accumulation of moments that led to this very breath. This transition is like the silent resonance of a silver bell that has been struck once and continues to vibrate through the dark. The initial strike is the size of the sound, but the fading hum of the initial strike is the measure of its age. We are now standing at the threshold where the architecture of space meets the river of history, preparing to walk through the corridors of our own written records to find the first dates of the world. Drifting deeper into the corridors of our collective memory, we find ourselves in an era where the boundary between the sacred and the empirical was not a wall, shared horizon. For centuries, the biblical narrative served as the foundational inventory of human existence, a source document that offered more than just moral guidance. It provided a rigid, structured framework for the very passage of time. In a world before the layers of the earth had been read like pages of a book, the written word of the patriarchs was the single flickering candle in a vast, unlit chamber, illuminating the reach of the past. History was not a series of geological epics, but a direct, unbroken line of human experience, meticulously recorded through generations. This reliance on scripture was not merely an act of faith, but a rigorous scholarly endeavor. Without the radioactive isotopes or fossil records that we lean upon today, the intellectual giants of the 17th century turned to the genealogical sequences of the Old Testament as precise chronological data. They viewed these records as a literal sequence of events, where each lifespan was a measurable unit of duration. James Ussher, the Archbishop of Armagh, represents the pinnacle of this pursuit. He did not merely read these texts, he calculated them by synchronizing the biblical records of lineage with known astronomical events and secular histories of the Persians and Romans. He sought to create a universal timeline. To Ussher and his contemporaries, the Bible was a historical laboratory, and the lineages of the ancients were the variables in a grand equation designed to solve the mystery of the world's beginning. Letting this knowledge settle, imagine a vast, hand-bound codex of the first dawn where every name is a link in a heavy, golden chain of ancestry stretching back to the very first sunrise. Each generation is a glowing coal passed from hand to hand through the night, keeping the fire of identity alive. We are looking at a world that felt much smaller and more intimate, a reachable landscape of the deep past, where the distance between the present moment and the creation was not an incomprehensible abyss of billions of years, but a journey across a familiar territory. This chronological structure acted as a protective canopy of the patriarchal line, a ceiling of chronological certainty that shielded the human mind from the terrifying infinity of the void. It was an intricate embroidery of names and ages, a raiment of time that felt warm and understandable, providing a home for the soul within a history that had a clear beginning. We are moving through a scriptorium where the ink is still wet on the first page, feeling the texture of a history that was once as tangible as the hewn rock of a fortress. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves in the quiet presence of a mind seeking the ultimate order, watching as the vastness of the past is distilled into a sequence of definitive numbers. James Ussher approached the biblical narrative not merely as a collection of stories, but as a rigorous chronological ledger, where the lifespans of the patriarchs functioned as the primary units of a cosmic accounting. He treated the lineage from Adam to Noah, and then from Noah to the covenant with Abraham, as a series of interlocking beams in a grand architectural project of time. By summing the age of each father at the birth of his firstborn, he was constructing a chronological spine, bone by bone, ensuring that the skeleton of history remained upright and unbroken. Each name was a sturdy link in an unbroken sequence of iron links that pulled the present moment closer to the dawn of existence, turning the nebulous fog of the deep past into a solid, measurable path. To ensure this path was grounded in the physical reality of the world, Ussher sought a synchronization point, a sturdy pier where the river of scripture met the ocean of recorded secular history. He found this vital connection in the death of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, a historical event whose date was anchored in the records of multiple ancient civilizations. Using this as his fixed celestial coordinate in a shifting sky, he worked his way backward through the complex reigns of the kings of Judah and Israel, carefully reconciling the overlapping years and the varying calendars of the ancient Near East with the precision of a jeweler cutting a diamond. He was not just counting years. He was harmonizing the rhythms of different cultures, seeking the singular pulse that drove all of human experience. It was a monumental effort of synthesis, treating the disparate annals of the Persians, Greeks, and Romans as fragments of a single, shattered mirror that he was patiently piecing back together. Imagine a master horologist assembling a grand timepiece from a pile of scattered gears, where each gear is the life of a patriarch. He fits the teeth of one generation into the notches of the next, feeling for the subtle friction of a missing decade or the smooth alignment of a well-recorded era. This methodology transformed the ancient texts into a mathematical landscape, a territory where every genealogy was a milepost and every patriarchal death was a boundary marker. It was like following a series of signal fires lit across a dark mountain range, each fire representing a life that held the light of continuity until the next could be ignited. We are crossing a lofty viaduct built from the heavy timber of human lifespans, feeling the stability of a history that has been measured, counted, and finally brought within the reach of human understanding. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves standing before a singular, sharpened point in the vastness of the past. James Ussher did not merely offer an era, he offered an appointment. In 1650, his publication of the Annals of the Old Testament crystallized the fluid, shifting memories of antiquity into a definitive, prismatic moment by placing the beginning of the world on the evening preceding Sunday, October 23, 4004 BC. He provided a specific, narrow gateway for the entirety of the human story. This was not a vague or poetic once upon a time, but a calculated entry point into the fabric of reality. This date eventually found its way into the margins of the King James Bible, where it sat as an unblinking guardian for generations. It transformed a scholarly calculation into a cultural bedrock, a chronological seal that authenticated the history of the world for the faithful, the skeptical, and the curious alike, embedding the concept of a 6,000-year-old Earth into the very marrow of Western thought. The methodology behind this was a feat of rigorous synchronization. Ussher aligned the intricate biblical chronologies with the known astronomical cycles and the recorded reigns of Babylonian, Persian, and Roman rulers. He navigated the treacherous waters where the Julian and Hebrew calendars diverged, seeking a moment where the celestial movements and the spiritual narrative met in perfect, resonant harmony. The choice of an autumn start reflected a profound philosophical conviction that the world was created in its full, ripe maturity, with trees heavy with fruit and the earth prepared for its first stewards. It was a vision of a completed, functional world springing into existence at the stroke of a divine pen, a universe born not as a fragile seedling, but as a fully realized landscape. Imagine this date as the very first drop of water that started the long, steady flow of the clepsydra of the ages. We are looking at a master key finally fitted into the heavy lock of time, turning with a metallic click that echoes through the corridors of the centuries. This date served as a sturdy hitching post for the collective imagination, a place where the wandering thoughts of a civilization could be tethered to a firm, unyielding sense of beginning. It was a first surveyor's stake driven into the void, a mark from which all other distances could be measured. It provided a sense of domesticity to the infinite, turning the terrifying expanse of the deep past into a familiar, reachable domain, where every path led back to a single, solid point of entry. Within this framework, the universe felt not like an abandoned ruin of impossible age, but like a well-tended manor, recently built and still warm from the presence of its architect. It was a temporal fireplace, a central point of heat and light that gave the human family a sense of being at the very beginning of their journey, rather than lost in the middle of a weary and ancient epic. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves standing before the monumental structure of James Ussher's mind, a space often unfairly simplified by the casual glances of the modern era. While today's perspective might view a specific date for creation as a quaint artifact of a less scientific age, to do so overlooks the staggering academic rigor that defined its construction. Ussher was not a man of idle speculation. He was one of the most formidable scholars of the 17th century, a master of ancient languages, and a tireless researcher of the classical world. His work was the pinnacle of humanistic scholarship, representing a Herculean effort to synthesize the disparate fragments of human history into a single, cohesive timeline. He lived in an era where the boundaries between sacred and secular knowledge were not walls of separation, but rather complementary facets of a unified truth. To him, the task of dating the beginning was the ultimate intellectual challenge, requiring the same precision that a modern researcher might apply to the movements of celestial bodies. The methodology employed was a masterclass in cross-disciplinary analysis. He did not simply count the generations listed in ancient texts. He painstakingly synchronized them with the known histories of the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. He accounted for the complexities of the Julian calendar and the shifting lunar cycles, wrestling with the discrepancies found between various manuscripts. He treated these records not merely as lore, but as data points in a massive chronological register. This was a serious endeavor that leveraged the absolute best textual sources available at the time, treating every king's reign and every recorded eclipse as a fixed coordinate in a vast, multidimensional grid. It was an exercise in extreme logical consistency, where a single error in a minor lineage could collapse the entire edifice. He was effectively spanning the gulf created by the silence of deep time, using the only materials he had, the written records of civilizations that had long since turned to dust. We might visualize this work as a master mathematician laboring over a singular, massive equation that spans the entire wall of a silent archive. It was a grand mosaic assembled from the broken tiles of 100 different cultures. Ussher acted as the master mason, fitting the jagged edges of Babylonian astronomy and the smooth stones of Roman law into a single, seamless pavement of history. It was a luminous marker of logic built on a coast of shadows, a structure intended to guide the human mind through the fog of the unrecorded past. Instead of seeing it as a cage of dogma, we should see it as a finely tuned instrument, a celestial astrolabe made of ink and paper, designed to measure the distance between the present moment and the very first pulse of existence. It was the highest expression of a mind seeking order, a noble attempt to find the singular melody within a cacophony of ancient whispers. This was the foundational granite upon which the early scientific world stood, a testament to the human desire to know exactly where we are on the atlas of the absolute. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet corners of the mind, we begin to see how this vault of limited years acted as a powerful lens, focusing the gaze of early naturalists onto a world of sudden, violent motion. Because the timeline was so compact, the jagged peaks of the world and the deep, winding scars of the valleys could not be the work of a deliberate artisan of the seasons. Instead, they were seen as the results of grand, convulsive spasms. This was the era of catastrophism, a paradigm that viewed the earth not as a slow-growing organism, but as a survivor of a series of immense, sudden shocks. Within this framework, the Great Flood was not merely a spiritual narrative. It was the primary geological engine, a high-velocity architect that reshaped the crust in a feverish instant of history. Geological constraints required that the vast layers of sedimentary rock and the strange presence of sea creatures atop the highest mountains be explained by a single global upheaval. There was no room for the silent, microscopic work of eons. Every canyon was a sudden tear in the fabric of the land, and every mountain was a frantic thrust of the earth's cooling skin. It was as if the entire history of the world were a single, intense orchestral crescendo, rather than a symphony that unfolds over a long summer evening. This view turned the landscape into a series of frozen echoes from a time of chaos, where the laws of nature were momentarily amplified to a deafening roar. In this world of rapid transformation, the Earth was a young, scarred face, its features carved by the swift blade of catastrophe rather than the soft touch of time. We were living in the immediate aftermath of a divine restructuring, walking upon a surface that was still settling from its most recent and most violent birth. This perspective transformed the study of the earth into a form of forensic investigation, where every boulder and every stratum was a piece of evidence from a crime scene of cosmic proportions. The natural philosopher was not watching a garden grow. He was examining the shattered pottery of a great upheaval, trying to reconstruct the vessel of the world from the shards left behind by the deluge. The very rocks beneath our feet were seen as the feverish script of a storm, written in the language of silt and stone. This paradigm dominated the human imagination, providing a dramatic and immediate explanation for the rugged majesty of the physical realm, ensuring that every cliffside was a monument to a moment of total, transformative power. It was a world where time was tight and energy was boundless, a brief but thunderous prologue to the human story. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves at the threshold of a quieter revolution, one where the roar of the deluge begins to fade into the steady, rhythmic pulse of observation. As the 18th century dawned, the intellectual climate shifted from the dramatic interpretations of upheaval to the meticulous study of the mundane. Naturalists began to speak of the book of nature as a primary source of truth, a living document that could be read with the same devotion once reserved for scripture. This was the era of the great galleries of the open air, where the scholars of the Enlightenment traded the dim light of the scriptorium for the bright, unfiltered sun of the field. They began to see the earth not as a static stage for human drama, but as a dynamic, self-recording entity. When these early geologists looked at the winding paths of river valleys, they saw something more profound than a simple drainage system. They recognized the slow-motion calligraphy of the rain, a process where every drop of water acted as a microscopic chisel, wearing down the granite of ages through sheer persistence. They observed the sedimentary layers in the cliffsides, the stratigraphy of the world, and realized that these banded colors were the stony register of the silt. Each layer represented a season of calm, a period of deposition that required centuries to accumulate just a few inches of depth. The math of the earth simply did not align with the compressed calendars of the past. If a river took 10,000 years to lower its bed by a single meter, then the deep canyons of the world were testaments to a duration that dwarfed the entirety of recorded human history. This shift in perception was like discovering that the house you lived in was built upon the ruins of 1,000 previous cities, each with its own birth and decay. It introduced the concept of deep time, a concept that stretched the human imagination until it touched the borders of the infinite. The natural philosopher became a translator of the unfolding manuscript of the lithosphere, reading the history of the world in the grain of the sandstone and the curve of a fossilized shell. They were no longer looking for the fingerprints of a sudden creator, but for the gradual, relentless laws of physics and chemistry. This was the beginning of an intellectual expansion, where the universe ceased to be a brief, bright flash and became the boundless archives of the strata, where every pebble was a volume and every mountain range was a shelf containing the dust of the stars settling into the pages of the soil. We were beginning to understand that we are residents of a world that breathes in eons, a place where the fluid quill of the river writes a story far older and more complex than any we had dared to imagine. Drifting deeper into the silence of the earth, we encounter a mind that dared to look past the horizon of human memory and see the planet for what it truly is, a self-renewing engine of incredible age. In 1788, James Hutton, a man who would become known as the father of modern geology, stood upon the rocky shores of Scotland and felt the weight of a staggering realization. He looked at the unconformities in the stone, specifically at Sycamore Point, where vertical ribbons of ancient greywacke were overlain by horizontal beds of red sandstone, and realized that the world was not a static monument, but a living, breathing process. This collision of strata represented a gap in time, so vast it made the human heart falter. Hutton declared that he saw no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end. This was the birth of uniformitarianism, the profound and revolutionary principle that the forces we witness in our own short lifespans, the gentle wearing away of a cliffside by the salt spray, the quiet accumulation of silt at the mouth of a stream, are the very same architects that built the Himalayas and carved the deepest canyons. It was an invitation to view the world not through the lens of sudden, divine intervention, but through the patient, relentless application of physical laws over unimaginable durations. He understood that the earth is a system of grand recycling, where mountains are slowly ground into sand by the elements, carried to the sea to settle in dark, heavy layers, and eventually forged once more into hard stone by the subterranean heat of the interior. This perspective transformed our understanding of time from a shallow pond into a vast, bottomless ocean. It suggests that the present is the key to the past, a steady pulse that has beaten since the dawn of the world. Imagine the planet as a grand, invisible potter's wheel of the eons, turning so slowly that its motion is imperceptible to the fleeting eye of a human, yet powerful enough to shape the very bones of the continent. Every raindrop becomes a tiny, persistent hammer, and every breeze a delicate stroke of the steady, rhythmic sandpaper of the wind. We are standing upon a surface that is being constantly reimagined, a place where the tireless friction of existence works with a quiet, terrifying grace. In this vision, the earth does not need a dramatic start or a fiery conclusion. It simply is, an eternal cycle of renewal that operates with the patient digestion of the mountain, turning the solid into the fluid and back again. We find ourselves resting on the results of 1 billion years of soft footfalls of the seasons, realizing that the ground beneath us is not a fixed stage, but a slow-motion furnace of the deep, constantly refining the substance of our reality, ensuring that the story of the earth is never finished, only rewritten in the enduring language of the rock. Letting this knowledge settle into the quiet spaces of the mind, we begin to perceive the world through the lens of a singular, patient observation made by James Hutton. He stood upon the banks of rivers, not merely seeing water in motion, but witnessing a persistent, invisible labor that works against the apparent permanence of the earth. Hutton's genius lay in the simple, profound extrapolation of the mundane. He watched the way a stream carried away a few grains of silt, the way a summer rain slightly deepened a groove in the hillside, and he saw in these small events the mechanism of a vast geological engine. He measured these changes not in the frantic pace of human ambition, but in the infinitesimal units of the millimeter, the smallest scale of visible change. He reasoned with a mathematical serenity that if a river, through its constant and gentle persistence, erodes its valley at the rate of a single millimeter each year, a distance no greater than the thickness of a single strand of hair, then the staggering depth of a 1-kilometer canyon represents a duration that defies the traditional boundaries of human memory. 1 kilometer, composed of 1 million millimeters, requires 1 million years of unceasing flow. This was more than a mere calculation. It was a conceptual shattering of the world's walls. By applying the logic of the present to the monuments of the past, Hutton expanded the age of the earth from a few fleeting millennia to a staggering span of millions of years. Imagine the landscape as a gargantuan block of solid shadow, and the river as a sculptor who works with a brush made of liquid time. Each year, the sculptor removes only a translucent dusting of stone, a layer so thin it is almost a ghost, barely perceptible to the eye, but cumulative in its power. To carve a valley deep enough to swallow the horizon, the sculptor must work for an eternity of silent afternoons. This realization transformed the earth from a young, static stage into a vast, ancient theater of duration. It replaced the sudden, violent act of creation with a slow, rhythmic progression, suggesting that the ground beneath our feet is a parchment of unimaginable patience. We are looking at the earth not as a finished object, but as a process that moves with the deliberate pace of a cooling star, where every deep ravine is an autograph of 1 million winters, and every rounded peak is the result of 1 billion soft touches from the atmosphere. In this new understanding, the mountains are not eternal sentinels, but temporary features, being slowly dismantled and transported to the sea, where they will eventually form the foundations of new continents. This logic of the long view invites us to breathe with the rhythm of the stone, recognizing that the world is a living, breathing entity whose life cycle operates on a scale so grand that our entire history is but a single throb in its stone veins. We are standing on the threshold of a profound displacement. As the sturdy walls of our historical house begin to expand into the infinite, letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves standing in a landscape where the familiar boundaries of our importance have quietly dissolved. This shift represents the great psychological exile of our species, a movement away from the hearth of a human-centric universe into the cool, impartial air of the infinite. In the earlier chronologies, the time before our arrival was a mere prelude, a brief and functional preparation for the main event of human history. We were the protagonists of a drama that occupied the entire duration of the world, with every star and every stone positioned as a backdrop for our development. But as the concept of deep time took root, the proportions of reality underwent a radical transformation. We were forced to recognize that the earth had been a thriving, changing, and violent theater for eons before the first human footfall. The technical reality of this displacement is found in the stratigraphic columns that stretch down into the dark, where layer after layer reveals a world of ancient climates and extinct life forms that had no knowledge of us and no need for our witness. In the vastness of the Phanerozoic Aeon, the Holocene, the epoch of human dominance, is but a microscopic sliver, a thin veneer of sediment atop miles of rock that speak only of trilobites, dinosaurs, and the slow drift of continents. Our entire civilization, with its grand wars, its delicate art, and its intricate philosophies, occupies only the faint residue of the planetary crust. We are a recent arrival in a history so vast it is indifferent to our presence. To understand this is to experience a quiet humbling of the spirit, a realization that we are not the masters of time, but its briefest guests. It is as if we have spent our lives believing we were the sole occupants of a great manor, only to discover we are merely a single moth fluttering for a heartbeat in a cavern that has held the wind for ages. We are the temporary dusting of snow on an escarpment that has watched the moon for 1 billion years. This realization is like looking at a grand, ancient garment that covers the earth, only to find that our era is a single, microscopic stitch at the very edge of the hem. We are the fleeting reflection of a passing cloud on the surface of a lightless lake that has remained still for an eternity. In this vast chronology, our existence is a briefest spark in the turbine of the eons, a momentary awareness in a mind that has been dreaming for billions of years before we woke. We are the last whispered syllable of a story told by the stars, finding our voice only as the sun begins its long, slow afternoon. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves standing at a quiet but profound threshold, where the intimate architecture of human history meets the staggering, wordless expanse of the deep past. For generations, the world was perceived as a well-lit room, its corners defined by the familiar lineages of the ancients, and its duration measured in the manageable spans of a few hundred grandfathers. There there was a deep-seated theological necessity for this human-scale history, a desire for the stage to be set specifically for the arrival of its principal actors. This was the world as a sanctuary, a place where the divine and the mortal walked in close chronological proximity. But as the inquisitive minds of the Enlightenment began to peer into the wounds of the earth, the silence of the stone began to grow heavy. The tension arose not from a desire to disprove the sacred, but from the undeniable friction between two different ways of knowing. The evidence gathered from the tilting of strata and the presence of extinct creatures began to outline a narrative that did not fit within the traditional 6 millennium frame. This created a rupture in the sense of cosmic belonging. If the earth had endured for untold millions of years before the first human breath, then the world was not merely a backdrop for our story. It was a vast, indifferent process that had operated for eons in our absence. This realization forced a painful recalibration of the human spirit. The 19th century scientific conflicts were the echoes of this internal struggle. As thinkers tried to reconcile the book of Revelation with the book of nature, they sought to find a way to keep the warmth of the spiritual hearth while acknowledging the vast, cold dark of the geological night. This shift is like a sleeper who has dreamt they were in a small, safe cottage, only to wake and find they are resting on the deck of a great ship in the middle of a boundless ocean. The cottage was the human-scale history, a place of boundaries and familiar sounds. The ocean is the deep time revealed by geology, a terrifyingly beautiful scale of existence where the waves have been rolling for an eternity before we arrived. We are like poets trying to find a rhyme for a language that has no words for us, or cartographers attempting to map a star that burned out long before our eyes were capable of sight. The tension is the sound of the old walls cracking as the house of our understanding expands to hold the weight of the mountains. We are learning to breathe in a thinner, colder air, finding a new kind of grace in the realization that we are not the masters of the house, but the latest guests in a palace that has been hosting the stars for an age beyond reckoning. Drifting deeper into this rhythmic pulse of discovery, we encounter the mind of Edmund Halley, a man who looked not only at the returning fire of comets, but at the vast, briny depths beneath his feet. In the year 1715, Halley turned away from the constraints of scripture and the frantic timescales of catastrophe to propose a more measured chemical clock. He observed that the world is a closed system of circulation, a grand hydrological machine that hums with a quiet, persistent logic. His hypothesis was elegant in its simplicity. The oceans, those vast cradles of life, were not always the salt-laden expanses we know today. He imagined them as pristine, freshwater basins at the moment of their birth, mirrors of the sky that held no trace of the bitter minerals we now associate with the deep. The mechanics of this clock relied on the tireless work of the Earth's arteries. Halley understood that as rain falls upon the mountains and plains, It acts as a gentle solvent, whispering against the stone and soil, coaxing out tiny particles of salt and mineral wealth. These rivers, like silver threads weaving through the landscape, carry their microscopic cargo down to the sea. Once there, the sun performs its part in the alchemy, lifting the water back into the atmosphere through evaporation, yet leaving the heavy salts behind. Because the salt has no escape, it accumulates, layer by invisible layer, year after year, century after century. It is a linear progression, a slow thickening of the water's character that Halley believed could be measured by calculating the total mass of salt currently held within the global reservoir and dividing it by the annual contribution from all the world's rivers. He believed we could find the definitive date when the first drop of rain met the first dry basin. Imagine the ocean as a great, translucent chalice that has been standing in a steady rain for an eternity. Each river is a slow-dripping faucet, adding a single, microscopic grain of sediment to the bottom of the vessel. The water level remains constant, balanced by the invisible breath of the wind, but the essence of the fluid changes, growing denser and more complex with every passing age. It is the ledger of the land, a chemical diary where every storm and every eroding cliffside has left a permanent signature. In Halley's vision, the sea was not a static entity, but a growing record, a saline archive that remembered the touch of every continent it had ever washed against. It was a bold attempt to find a physical constant in a world that seemed otherwise chaotic, a way to use the very taste of the spray on one's lips to map the distance back to the morning of the world. We are standing on the shore of a giant, liquid hourglass, where the sand is dissolved in the tide, and the ticking of the seconds is found in the slow, silent saturation of the blue. Letting this knowledge settle, we find ourselves standing on the shoreline of a new kind of inquiry, where the very taste of the sea becomes a measure of the infinite. In 1715, Edmund Halley, the same visionary who tracked the wandering path of comets through the dark, turned his analytical gaze from the celestial heights to the brine of the deep. He was searching for a terrestrial clock, a physical mechanism that could quantify the vastness of time without relying on the lineage of ancient kings or the ink of sacred scrolls. He looked at the ocean not as a static, unchanging body, but as a dynamic reservoir, a chemical ledger that had been meticulously recording the history of the planet since the first rain began to fall. Halley's hypothesis was elegant and profound in its simplicity. He proposed that the primeval oceans were originally fresh, pristine basins of water. Over the eons, the relentless cycle of the weather acted as a silent conveyor. Rivers, functioning like veins carrying the mineral essence of the continents, washed microscopic amounts of salt from the rocks of the land into the great maritime basins. Once there, the sun performed its quiet, daily extraction, drawing pure water vapor back into the sky to form clouds, while the salt, too heavy for the air, remained trapped in the depths. This process, Halley reasoned, was a one-way street of accumulation, a grand distillation that never ceased. By measuring the current salinity of the world's oceans and estimating the rate at which rivers delivered their annual salty tribute, one could, in theory, calculate how long this great engine had been running. It was a linear progression, a mathematical arrow pointing back through the centuries to a hypothetical moment of total purity. Imagine the ocean as a gargantuan ceramic bowl, initially filled with the clearest spring water. Every year, 1,000 tiny spoons of salt are stirred into the mix. The water may rise and fall with the seasons, breathing out its moisture to the heavens, but the salt never leaves. It only grows more concentrated, a thickening soup of terrestrial memory. The sea becomes a slow-brewing tea of the Earth's crust, where every sip reveals the duration of the steep. We are looking at a giant, liquid hourglass, where the grains do not fall from top to bottom, but dissolve and linger, turning the medium itself into a record of the passage. Halley saw the salt as the residue of time itself, a crystalline witness to the slow, patient erosion of the world's foundations, a way to turn the bitterness of the waves into the clarity of a quantifiable age. Letting this knowledge settle, we begin to perceive the hidden complexity that eluded the early pioneers of deep time. Halley's clock was built on a premise of permanence, a belief that once the Earth's mineral essence entered the sea, it became a permanent resident of the blue. It was an optimistic vision of a world that remembers everything it has ever lost to the rain, a steady accumulation of terrestrial secrets. This salt clock assumed a linear progression, a predictable climb from a pristine beginning to the briny present, much like a candle burning at a constant rate in a windless room. It imagined the ocean as a final destination, a vault where the gold of the land was stored and never withdrawn. This sense of a one-way journey provided a comforting simplicity to the early scientific mind, offering a clear, straight path back to the dawn of the world. However, the reality of the ocean is not one of simple accumulation, but of a profound and dynamic chemical equilibrium. The sea is not a passive basin. It is a living laboratory of constant exchange. The salt we observe today is not the total sum of all erosion since the beginning of time, but rather the balance point of a massive, global transaction. Salt is constantly being stripped away from the water through processes that operate on a scale of millions of years. When shallow seas are isolated and baked by the sun, they leave behind massive evaporite deposits, thick crusts of mineral wealth that are eventually buried under layers of sediment, removing them from the liquid ledger. Even more dramatically, the very floor of the ocean acts as a slow-moving conveyor belt. Through tectonic subduction, the saline crust and the minerals trapped within the seafloor are dragged down into the furnace of the Earth's mantle, recycling the sea's salt back into the deep interior of the planet. The concentration of salt is not a measure of age, but a signature of a steady state, a level maintained by a system that loses as much as it gains. Imagine a grand stone fountain in a quiet courtyard. We watch the water cascade into the basin, and we might think we can tell how long the fountain has been running by measuring the height of the water. But we do not see the hidden pipes beneath the flagstones, the drains that carry the water back to the pump, or the subtle mist that drifts away on the breeze. The ocean is not a cup being filled, but a rhythmic pulse, a breathing lung of mineral and tide. It is like a busy marketplace where the number of people remains constant, not because no one ever arrives, but because for every soul that enters the gate, another departs through the shadows of the rear exit. The salt is a transient guest, a traveler resting in a vast blue inn before being called back into the stone of the earth. We are not looking at a history of growth, but at the elegant stasis of a world that knows how to recycle its own foundations. A masterpiece of balance where the memory of the land is whispered to the sea, only to be swallowed once more by the fire of the deep. Letting this knowledge settle, we begin to see that Edmund Halle's true gift was not the specific number he reached, but the lens he ground for us to peer through. He was a pioneer who stepped away from the dusty libraries of theological speculation and the circular arguments of textual interpretation. Before him, the age of the world was often treated as a riddle of words, a mystery buried in the genealogies of kings and the metaphorical days of ancient creation stories. But Halley looked at the salt in the sea and saw a physical system, a grand machine of matter and motion that followed the same ironclad rules as the planets he mapped across the heavens. This was the birth of the Earth as an empirical entity. By treating the salinity of the oceans as a measurable variable, he introduced the concept of conservation laws to the story of our origins. He understood that the world is a closed ledger where nothing is truly lost, only transformed and relocated. In his view, the salt was not a divine decoration, but a physical substance being transported by the energy of the sun and the gravity of the slopes. He moved the debate from the realm of the why to the rigorous discipline of the how much, transforming the planet from a theater of miracles into a laboratory of constants. This shift was monumental. It meant that the history of the world was written in the language of physics, a language that could be deciphered through observation and the steady application of mathematical logic. Imagine the Earth as a grand, sealed glass sphere, a celestial terrarium where every drop of moisture and every grain of mineral is accounted for by an invisible steward. This steward does not create new materials from the void, nor does he allow a single molecule to vanish into nothingness. Instead, he meticulously moves the pieces across a vast, internal board. The rain is a loan taken from the clouds, paid back by the rivers, while the salt is a currency being deposited into a deep, oceanic vault. This is the great balance sheet of existence, where the total sum of the world remains constant, even as its forms shift and swirl. Halley recognized that the Earth is not a static sculpture, but a dynamic engine of conservation, a system where the past is physically preserved in the ratios of the present. We are living within a masterpiece of cosmic accounting, where every sunrise and every falling leaf is part of a balanced equation that has been running since the first light touched the water. He was the first to realize that the earth is a self-contained vessel, a massive crucible where the ingredients of life and stone are stirred, but never discarded. This was the transition from a world defined by the ink of scribes to one defined by the weight of elements. He saw the ocean not as a bottomless mystery, but as a quantifiable volume, a vessel whose contents could be analyzed with the same precision one might use to weigh a handful of gold or measure the arc of a comet. This realization turned the earth into a physical clock, one whose gears were the very cycles of nature itself, and whose scaffolding of history was built upon the unchanging laws of the physical realm. Drifting deeper into this quantifiable world, we find the Count Buffon standing before the roaring heat of a forge, ready to translate the language of fire into the language of years. He looked upon the earth and saw not a static monument, but a celestial body in the process of cooling, a molten drop cast into the freezing void of space. To understand the age of our home, he stepped away from the dusty shelves of the library and into the visceral heat of the workshop, transforming the abstract question of time into a tangible study of thermodynamics. He envisioned the earth as a cooling ember in the hearth of the solar system, an incandescent sphere that had been slowly surrendering its heat to the darkness of the vacuum for unimaginable ages. His method was as elegant as it was revolutionary. He commissioned a series of iron spheres, graduated in size from small handheld orbs to heavy, dense cannonballs. One by one, these spheres were thrust into the intense heat of a furnace until they glowed with the brilliance of a newborn star. Buffon then placed them in the open air, acting as a silent observer to their slow return to stillness. With the meticulous care of a watchmaker, he timed how long it took for each sphere to cool until it could be touched, and then until it reached the ambient temperature of the room. He was looking for the mathematical bridge between the palm of his hand and the radius of the world. He observed that as the diameter of the sphere increased, the time it took to shed its heat grew in a predictable, measurable ratio. In this laboratory, each iron ball became a surrogate world, a tiny, glowing messenger carrying the laws of thermodynamics in its metallic heart. He was treating the planet like a massive loaf of bread pulled from a cosmic oven, its crust gradually hardening and thickening, while the interior retained the memory of the flame. This was a tactile dialogue with the primordial, an attempt to grasp the duration of the eons by monitoring the slow retreat of the incandescent ghost within a piece of metal. By extrapolating the cooling rates of these small man-made planets, he sought to calculate the vast span of time required for a sphere the size of the Earth to transition from a liquid fire to a world capable of supporting the delicate architecture of life. It was the first time the heat of the forge was used to measure the depth of the past, turning the physical properties of matter into a compass for navigating the silent centuries of the Earth's infancy. Letting this knowledge settle into the cool, dark soil of human understanding, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of 1778, a year when the boundaries of the past were stretched until they began to tear. Georges Louis Leclerc, Count Buffon, finally committed his findings to the page in his monumental work, The Epochs of Nature. This was not merely a book. It was a quiet declaration of independence for the physical world. For centuries, the timeline of the Earth had been a small, well-tended garden, bounded by the iron fences of biblical genealogy that suggested a history of roughly 6,000 years. Buffon, however, looked past these fences toward a horizon that had been hidden in the mist of dogma. He knew that to speak of a deeper history was to invite the cold wind of religious censure, a risk that shadowed every ink stroke of his manuscript. Yet the heat of his experiments demanded a larger container than the one provided by tradition. The result he reached through his patient monitoring of glowing iron was a staggering 75,000 years. To our modern ears, this number feels like a brief afternoon, but in the 18th century, it was a seismic expansion of reality. It exceeded the accepted chronology by a factor of 12, effectively pushing the creation of the world back into a darkness that the contemporary mind was not yet prepared to navigate. Buffon calculated that it took roughly 25,000 years for the Earth to cool from its molten state to a temperature where it could be touched, and another 50,000 years to reach the state we inhabit today. He was attempting to measure the thermal momentum of a planet, treating the Earth as a grand thermodynamic ledger, where every degree lost was a page turned in a massive, ancient volume. By scaling up the cooling rates of his experimental spheres, he moved from the scale of the workshop to the scale of the cosmos, providing the first quantifiable glimpse into the true magnitude of geological duration. This 75,000-year figure was the first crack in the glass of a small, comfortable room, allowing the vast, cold air of the outside universe to rush in. It was a bridge built of cooling iron, spanning a chasm that had previously been considered uncrossable. If the biblical timeline was a single candle lighting a small study, Buffon's result was the first gray light of a dawn that revealed the study was situated on the edge of a boundless continent. He had transformed the Earth from a static stage built for a brief human drama into a long-burning hearth that had been glowing for eons before the first spectator arrived. It was the first time the human mind dared to suggest that the biography of the world was written in a language of physical processes rather than just divine decrees. This number, though still a vast underestimate, served as a vital anchor point, a first stake driven into the deep silt of time, proving that the past was a territory far larger than the stories we had used to map it. Letting this knowledge settle, we begin to see the world not as a cold, static monument of stone, but as a grand vessel of energy that has been processing its own internal fire since the first moments of its coalescence. Buffon's transformative insight was in recognizing that the Earth possesses a profound thermal history, a narrative written in the slow migration of heat from its center to the surface. He understood that the warmth we encounter in the deep belly of the Earth is not a local anomaly, but a lingering pulse from an incandescent kiln of the early solar system, a residue of the chaotic energy that birthed the planets. This internal fire was, in his view, the primary driver of the globe's biography. By framing the Earth as a cooling sphere, he introduced a planetary lifespan governed by the laws of thermal decay, long before the formal study of thermodynamics had even begun. He envisioned the Earth as a massive reservoir of primordial power, a thermal core that was inevitably leaking its heat into the freezing reaches of the void. This shift turned the planet into a thermal workshop of the eons, where the temperature of the rocks served as a silent clock, ticking away the ages as the world gradually moved toward equilibrium. This foundational idea would eventually ignite the great debates of the Victorian era, where the cooling problem became the central lens through which the true age of the world was viewed. It suggested that time was not a series of arbitrary events, but a quantifiable descent from a state of high energy to one of quiet stability. Imagine the Earth as a heavy cast iron stove in a vast, darkened chamber, its thick metal walls still radiating a soft, persistent warmth from a fire that was stoked at the beginning of time. We are like small observers resting on the surface of this stove, feeling the heat, but only beginning to grasp the scale of the slow-release capsule of cosmic energy that sustains the world's motions. It is a planetary metabolism, a quiet thermal dispersal where the very rocks act as a spherical battery, discharging their ancient potential across the silence of the deep past. Every mountain and every valley is a byproduct of this waning warmth of a planetary thermal dusk, a testament to a world that is still cooling from its magnificent, fiery birth. Letting this knowledge settle, we turn our gaze from the invisible warmth of the core to the visible layers of the crust, where time has been pressed into a solid, readable form. In the early 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution carved new paths through the earth, men like William Smith began to notice a profound order hidden within the rubble. Smith, a canal engineer, realized that the rock strata were not merely chaotic piles of stone, but were organized like the pages of a book that had been bound by the weight of gravity itself. He observed that certain fossils appeared only in specific layers, and that this sequence of life, the faunal succession, remained constant across the landscape. This was a revelation of relative chronology. It meant that even without knowing the exact number of years that had passed, a geologist could determine which layer was older simply by the biological signatures etched within it. This insight allowed Charles Lyell and his contemporaries to partition the vastness of the deep past into manageable eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. These divisions are the grand chapters of the terrestrial narrative, representing the rise and fall of entire biological empires. The Paleozoic, or ancient life, speaks of a world dominated by strange marine invertebrates and the first ventures onto land. The Mesozoic, the middle life, is the age of the great reptiles. And the Cenozoic, our own era of recent life, marks the flourishing of mammals and the world we recognize today. This stratigraphic system acts as a petrified table of contents for the planet's biography. Imagine the Earth's crust as a sedimentary filing cabinet, where every drawer contains a specific set of biological documents that can never be found anywhere else in the stack. Each fossil is a letter in a biological alphabet, and when these letters are arranged in the order of their burial, they form words and sentences that describe the changing face of the world. We are walking upon a vertical tapestry of existence, where the threads are woven from limestone and shale, and the patterns are the shapes of shells and bones. The ground is a series of stacked horizons, each one a frozen moment of a different Earth, a distinct atmosphere, and a unique sun. It is a biological ledger where the Earth keeps a meticulous account of its residents, a grammar of the strata that allows us to translate the silence of the stone into the vibrant story of life's persistence. Every cliff face becomes a corridor of a sunken museum, and every quarry a scriptorium, where the ink of ancient seas has dried into the permanence of rock, offering us a map of time that is as reliable as the stars. Drifting deeper into the silence of the stone, we encounter a realization that fundamentally altered our perception of the Earth's endurance. The geologists of the 19th century looked at the massive sedimentary formations that define our landscapes, the towering white cliffs, and the deep, dark gorges. And they began to ask not just what they were, but how long they took to arrive. They saw the Earth as a patient collector of tiny things, a vast and quiet basin where the debris of life and the dust of mountains settle with an almost divine lack of hurry. This process of sedimentation is the Earth's own method of keeping time, a steady, rhythmic dusting that transforms the fluid into the firm over intervals that dwarf the span of human civilizations. Imagine a layer of limestone 1,000 feet thick, a monumental slab of pale rock stretching toward the horizon. When examined closely, this stone reveals itself to be a gargantuan necropolis of the microscopic. It is built from the infinitesimal shells of marine organisms, creatures so small they are nearly invisible to the naked eye. In life, they danced in the upper reaches of ancient oceans, and in death, they descended through the dark water like a persistent, ghostly snowfall. Scientists calculated that this biological rain accumulates at a rate of mere fractions of an inch per century. For 1,000 feet of this material to solidify into the rock we see today, the clock must have been ticking for hundreds of millions of years. This was not the sudden work of a catastrophe, but the deliberate, incremental labor of the eons. We are walking upon the accumulated patience of the planet, a landscape built one microscopic grain at a time. Each stratum is a heavy page in a book where the ink takes 1,000 years to dry, and the story it tells is one of a duration so vast it makes our own history seem like a single, fleeting heartbeat. The earth does not rush its masterpieces. It allows the weight of the water and the passage of the ages to press the ephemeral into the eternal. This realization turned every cliff face into a mathematical proof of antiquity, a silent witness to a world that was already ancient long before the first human footfall. We are drifting through a history that is measured in the slow-motion descent of silt, a quiet, vertical journey through the deep, sunless reaches of a time that knows no end. Letting this knowledge settle, we begin to perceive how the petrified silence of the strata became the essential foundation for the most profound shift in our understanding of life itself. When Charles Darwin stepped onto the deck of the Beagle, he carried more than just tools for observation. He carried the revolutionary volumes of Lyell's Geology, a gift that would provide the very dimensions of the stage upon which his own theories would eventually perform. To look at a cliff face was no longer just an exercise in identifying cold minerals. It was a way of measuring the boundless patience of the natural world. Darwin recognized that the infinitesimal variations he observed in the living world were the slow, grinding gears of a biological engine that required an immense amount of fuel in the form of duration, without the millions of years established by the geologists. The concept of natural selection would have been a mechanism without a workshop, a beautiful engine with no room to run. The geological evidence provided the temporal canvas, a vast and ancient expanse that allowed for the gradual accumulation of minute changes, transforming the static hierarchy of the past into a fluid, breathing lineage. He saw the earth not as a fixed gallery of completed works, but as a living laboratory where the rise and fall of mountain ranges was mirrored by the slow emergence and extinction of species. Each fossil found in a specific layer of rock was a biological signature that matched the physical age of the stone surrounding it, a confirmation that the Earth's crust was the primary witness to life's endurance. This was the great synthesis, the realization that the history of the soul and the history of the soil were written in the same ink, using the same grammar of slow, persistent change. Imagine a great tapestry being woven by a hand that moves so slowly it appears stationary to the human eye. The geology is the sturdy frame and the threads, while the biological evolution is the intricate pattern that slowly emerges across the centuries. If the frame were small and new, the pattern could only be simple and brief. But with a frame that stretches back into the sunless reaches of the deep past, the pattern can achieve a complexity that rivals the stars. Geology acted as the geological stagehand, silently moving the scenery of continents and oceans to allow the drama of life to unfold over eons. It was the slow-burning fuse of complexity, a process that required the cooling of the crust to provide a stable floor for the dance of the first cells. We are the inheritors of this partnership, the result of a bedrock of biological possibility that was laid down long before the first heartbeat. This connection between the stone and the spirit reminds us that we are not separate from the earth's long memory, but are instead a single, vibrant leaf on a tree whose roots are anchored in the very first layers of the world's cooling skin. We are drifting through a narrative where every mountain is a chapter, and every species is a word, spoken slowly into the vast silence of the temporal greenhouse.